What kind of mind figures out how to turn hunger itself into a weapon? Genghis Khan, the great leader of the Mongols, was the man who did exactly that. After a campaign so terrifying it shook entire kingdoms, he developed the ruthless art of the siege. Starve your enemy until their will breaks. His armies didn't just take cities. They swallowed them whole. They'd encircle the walls, cut off every road, and simply wait. And they could wait for a long time, not just days but weeks, even months. Inside those walls, things turned grim. People fought over crumbs of bread, bodies started vanishing, and before long, the living fed on the dead in silence. In 1219, when Genghis Khan turned his fury toward the Khwarezmian Empire, he set his sights on the proud city of Nishapur. The Mongols didn't waste time. To break through the defenses fast, they surrounded the city completely, cutting off every bit of food and water. They built tall siege towers and set up a tight ring around the walls so not a soul could sneak in or out. It wasn't just brutal, it was deliberate, a cold strategy meant to break both body and spirit. The Mongol engineers studied how long the city could hold out. They knew that when hunger reached its limit, despair would do the rest. Some towns surrendered before things got too bad. Others tried to fight, only to face beatings so cruel that surrender might have been kinder. The Persian historian Giovanni wrote that during these sieges, the people inside were sometimes driven to eat things no human should ever eat: scraps, filth, even the dead. Another account, by a man named M.V., described a city so ravaged by hunger that the dead lay unburied while starving dogs fed on their bellies. And when the walls finally fell, mercy was out of the question. The few survivors, weak, starved, broken, were either slaughtered outright or taken as captives. The siege by starvation wasn't just a tactic to win battles. It was a warning, a message carved into history. It said that anyone who dared resist would face not only death, but the slow humiliation of despair. The Mongols enslaved many, and the women suffered some of the worst fates imaginable. Under Genghis Khan's command, the Mongols unleashed one of the most ruthless campaigns the world has ever seen. They didn't just wipe out enemies, they erased entire communities. And every victory brought the same nightmare again. After the fall of each city, the women and children were dragged away into bondage. When they captured Bokhara in 1220, it was the same story: thousands of women and boys torn from their homes and taken by the Mongols. After the Mongols stormed a city, the spoils of war were divided, and people were part of that calculation. Many of the captured women were handed out to soldiers as a kind of grim payment for their service. The higher a man's rank, the greater his reward, and that included women of higher status. Some were forced to serve Mongol generals, and in rare cases even Genghis Khan himself. Those of lower rank weren't spared either. They were split among common soldiers or forced into brutal labor doing backbreaking work or worse. The Persian historian Giovanni, who chronicled the Mongol invasions, described how, right after a city fell, the conquerors would divide the survivors with chilling precision. Men were separated from women, parents from children, and all were driven into massive camps, places like the Edrei Quashim. His words weren't poetic, they were painfully literal. It showed the cold, systematic way the Mongols handled human lives, as if they were sorting livestock instead of people. Women, in particular, were selected and displayed according to their looks, age, or social standing. Some kept close to commanders, others sent away to serve elsewhere. Records from Chinese, Persian, and Russian sources all tell the same story. Mongol leaders treated captured women and children not just as prizes of war, but as living trophies, symbols of total domination. Taking a man's wife or child wasn't only about cruelty. It was about wiping away his legacy, erasing him from history itself. For many of those women, captivity became their new life. Some were kept in Mongol camps for years, forced to bear children or serve their captors. Others were sent to labor across the far reaches of the empire, from the plains of Central Asia all the way to the heart of China. Few, if any, ever saw their homes again. Their names, their identities were swallowed by the empire's expansion. In Genghis Khan's world, conquest wasn't only about seizing land. It was about claiming people, turning the conquered into tools of war and humiliation. Among the most defenseless were women, who suffered terribly in this brutal machine of conquest, caught between violence, servitude, and silence. Of all the ruthless tactics the Mongols used, one stood out for its cold calculation, something they called the human shield. It wasn't an accident of war. It was a deliberate policy. Civilians from recently conquered towns were rounded up and driven ahead of Mongol armies toward the next target. These people, women, children, the elderly, were forced to march at the front lines, taking the brunt of enemy fire. Their purpose was horrifyingly clear: to absorb the first wave of arrows, to reveal where the defenders' fire was strongest, and to die clearing a path for Mongol troops. One of the most infamous examples came during the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire in 1221, at the siege of the city of Urgench. As resistance stiffened and the defenses grew tougher, Genghis Khan ordered thousands of prisoners, most of them women, children, and old men, to advance toward the walls. They were sent forward not as soldiers, but as shields, sacrificed so the Mongols could win. The Persian historian Javani, who chronicled the Mongol campaigns in his famous work Jahangusha, or The History of the World Conqueror, wrote that the Mongols rarely spared lives when a city dared to resist. Those few they did keep alive were saved for one reason only: to be used. They forced one citizen to kill the next, he wrote, describing the terror as it spread like wildfire through the ranks of the helpless. These human captives became part of the Mongols' machinery of fear. They were pushed to the front lines, tied together in long chains to keep them from escaping, or placed in front of siege engines to absorb incoming fire. Some were forced to dig trenches and tunnels under enemy bombardment. Others were sent to set traps or fill moats, all while arrows rained down on them. If, by some miracle, they survived the assault, the Mongols usually finished them off afterward. Once they'd served their purpose, they were no longer needed. But this wasn't just a military tactic. It was psychological warfare in its purest, darkest form. It sent a message that echoed louder than any battle horn. Fight us, and you'll watch your own people die before you do. The sheer cruelty of it broke the will of many defenders before a single sword was even raised. For the Mongols, war wasn't about honor or mercy. It was about results. If victory required the death of thousands of innocent people to crush the spirit of their enemies, then that was simply the price of success. To Genghis Khan, war wasn't between armies, it was between civilizations. Entire populations were turned into weapons in his campaign for domination. And death, for those caught in the Mongols' path, often came in ways too brutal to imagine. In 1233, after the Mongols allied with the princes of Rus and the Kipchaks near the Khalkha River, they showed no hint of compassion, only cold, deliberate precision. Under the command of Genghis Khan's legendary generals, Subutai and Jebe, the Mongols didn't see their opponents as noble foes. They saw them as obstacles to be erased. Prince Mstislav of Kiev and the other captured Rus princes met an especially gruesome fate. According to Russian and Persian accounts, the Mongols laid the princes face down on the ground, alive. Then, in a calculated display of dominance, they built a wooden platform directly on top of their bodies. On that platform, the Mongol commanders held a victory feast, eating and drinking while their captives suffocated beneath them. The chronicles differ in small details, but the message is the same across all versions. The Mongols chose this method because it inflicted unbearable suffering without spilling blood. In their culture, especially when dealing with high-ranking enemies, it was often considered taboo to shed a noble's blood directly. So, they invented ways to kill that followed their code, ways that were technically bloodless but unimaginably cruel. As the feast went on, the weight of the platform and the men sitting above slowly crushed the life out of those beneath. By the time the banquet ended, the princes were dead, their bodies shattered, their dignity erased. This wasn't just vengeance, it was theater, a performance of absolute power meant to terrify anyone who might think of resisting. For the Mongols, execution was more than punishment. It was a message carved into the world, proof that fear itself could conquer where swords could not. The Mongols didn't just kill, they turned death itself into a kind of grim theater. Their executions weren't only about destroying a life. They were about proving dominance over memory, identity, and legacy. To rule by fear, they had to control not just the body, but the story that would be told afterward. And in that, they succeeded. Among the many punishments handed down under Genghis Khan's rule, one stood out for its sheer cruelty, a method reserved specifically for traitors. It was known as being dragged behind the horse. The name alone told you everything you needed to know. This wasn't some battlefield mercy killing or a quick end for the wounded. It was deliberate, a punishment saved for those who betrayed the Khan's trust. Deserters, thieves, spies, or anyone who dared to side with the enemy after pretending to surrender. In Mongol law, betrayal wasn't just disobedience. It was treason against the cosmic order, a sin that disrupted the unity of the Khan's world, and that, to them, demanded a punishment that matched the offense. When the sentence was passed, the condemned man's hands were tied, sometimes even broken, to keep him from struggling. Then, a thick rope was fastened around his body, often tied to the tail of a horse. At the officer's signal, the horse was whipped into motion, dragging the prisoner across rough ground, stones, dirt, ice, whatever the terrain offered. Death didn't always come fast. Sometimes it took minutes, sometimes longer, depending on how far they dragged him. By the end, there was nothing left but a mangled shape, a warning that betrayal would never go unanswered. This punishment was recorded again and again during the Mongol campaigns across Central Asia and the Middle East. Whenever a city under Mongol control rebelled or broke its oath, this fate awaited the ones they caught. To outsiders, the act looked monstrous, but to the Mongols it made perfect sense. Their entire empire ran on loyalty, absolute, unquestioning loyalty. Genghis Khan's Yasa, the great Mongol code of law, demanded that every man honor his commander and his kin above all else. Anyone who broke that unity wasn't just defying a ruler. They were threatening the balance that held their vast world together. The execution, brutal as it was, carried a kind of ceremony. To the Mongols, it wasn't chaos, it was order enforced. It was a message carved into flesh, meant to echo through generations. Loyalty is survival. Defiance is death. Even centuries later, it's hard not to shudder at the thought of it. The Mongol Empire wasn't merely a kingdom built by war. It was an engine of control that rewrote the rules of power. It didn't just conquer land, it conquered the idea of resistance itself. Fear became a language and punishment became its grammar. Their methods were never random acts of cruelty. Each one was a calculated statement, a way to show that no rebellion would go unanswered, no disobedience forgiven. Torture wasn't just pain, it was communication. It told every soul within the empire, we see everything and nothing stands against us. That was how the Mongols rose, from scattered tribes to masters of the largest land empire the world has ever known. Through terror, unity, and relentless will, they forged an empire that stretched from the deserts of Mongolia to the gates of Europe. The Persian historian Giovanni said it best. They came, they burned, they killed, they plundered, and then they left. And what they left behind wasn't just ashes and ruins, but the haunting reminder that power, in its purest form, often comes not from creation, but from destruction.